It is great to be with you all here today, and I hope that you've experienced a real good dose of Texas and Preston Trail hospitality for those of you who are not from Texas. And I thought I might just kind of give you the rest of the story of Jody telling about our bad economy marketing thing. Here's a learning from that. Don't blow a really good marketing campaign by ending your Easter service with a rap song. Because we did that, we thought it would work. It got a manifest. It was really incredible music, and it was actually a huge negative. So that was a learning from us. So we don't end big services with rap songs anymore. So that's kind of the last part of that particular story. Some of you, Terrell said, have been taking pictures and really enjoyed the building. And we actually took, this used to be an old manufacturing building that manufactured large circuit boards for defense contracting computers. And this was actually the largest plating room. There's a big hole here in the floor with grates, and they had these big plating machines and all this kind of nasty chemical stuff washed down over here into our worship leader's office. But before we moved in, we cleaned it environmentally. We took care of everything. So this is actually one of the cleanest buildings in all of Frisco. If you ever environmentally clean something, you have to come in and you have to vacuum every square inch, roof to ceiling, and wipe every square inch with a baby wipe. So you can actually eat off of most surfaces here in our church. Also, what we like to say is, if you like Home Depot, you will like our church. So that's kind of what we say about it. Has a nice open area and construction field. But we're glad that you are here. Well, Terrell asked me to speak to you all, especially those of you who may be senior leaders, about this whole issue of marketing and communication and the importance of it. And I know that many of you are not senior leaders here today, but you will actually be going back and you will be talking to your senior leaders, your senior pastor, about some things that you've been learning, some things that you would like to apply. Maybe your leadership at your church doesn't really understand yet the value of this kind of communication and the efforts that you really feel called to give toward kingdom purposes. Well, my goal today in my talk with you is some of it may be kind of a well-duh kind of thing for you if you've been a communications person for a long time. But my goal would be then to give you some really good biblically based talking points that are going to give you the ability to share with your senior leadership or your senior pastor the importance of doing the things that you're learning about today. So that's going to be my goal as we visit together on this afternoon. I'm going to make a very bold statement here, and here's a statement. I believe that one of God's biggest problems, and for me to say what a problem is for God is kind of arrogant, I know that, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. I think one of God's biggest problems has always been communication. Now stop and think about that for a second. Here is the God of creation who created a universe that is 200 billion light years across. He is spirit. He is not limited by time nor space. And He is trying to communicate His message of love and grace to finite creatures, fallen, twisted, broken, who are living under the limits of time and space. Hebrews opens with some very familiar words. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers, what? Through the prophets in various times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us through what? Through a Son. And the Old Testament is prima facie evidence that the Old Testament people didn't get it. The message didn't go through to a lot of the people. And so God, throughout His history, with His creation, with human beings, has struggled with this whole deal of communication. And I bet if I had time to sit down and visit with all of you, your conversations at your church would be very similar to our conversations here at Preston Trail. Communication is one of the biggest issues we deal with. Not just how do we communicate changes and things that are taking place, but how do we do announcements? There's not enough time in a service. How do we get the word out to people? I was talking to Lawrence a few moments ago, and there's kind of a trend now that now most people attend maybe perhaps 1 out of 3 weekends, and they still think they're, regularly attending your church. People don't listen or look at their emails anymore. They don't look at their snail mail that much anymore. So how in the world, in this kind of setting, do you communicate and have any kind of confidence that you're getting the word out or the message across? This reminds me of something that happened to my wife. My wife, back in the 90s, was a part-time anchor for Headline News in Atlanta. I was pastor of a church there. And this will date her a little bit. Back in the day, teleprompters were actually on conveyor belts. That is, there'd be a little conveyor belt in a room, and there'd be a camera sitting like this, and the conveyor belt would take the copy, underneath the camera, and then she would be able to read it on the teleprompter. Well, they made the transition while she was at CNN to make them digital and put them on computer, which is really cool because now they could edit and they could actually put in new stories, and she would have that there on the teleprompter. However, when they were first doing it, there were some bugs in the software, as you can imagine. So here's what happened. Whenever they would try to make a change in a story, if they didn't exit correctly, it shuffled all the stories in the teleprompter. And so one particular evening, she read her name. Hi, I'm Robin Johnson, and this is Headline News. And she did the first story, and she looked up, and it had gone back to what she had just read. And so she realized what was going on, and she looked down, and she read the next story out of her copy that was there. She looked back up. They still hadn't figured it out yet, so she thought, well, I'm going to pull some copy out of the bottom of this and just start reading it, and hopefully they'll be able to catch up with me. Because at CNN, unlike a local news station, they don't cut to commercial, if the anchor is having problems. It is, you only go to commercial when it's time to go to commercial. So here she is. She pulls up some new pages, and she starts reading the story. Today, the World Health Organization gave the world a bad environmental report card. Our fisheries are overhatched. Our fertile land is overtilled. Potable water is decreasing on every land surface, and several other things. And she got to the bottom, and it said, but the report said, and she looked, and she didn't have the next page. So she's looking down and looking at the camera, but the report said, other than that, everything is going to be okay. Next, and she goes on. Okay. Several months later, I was at a conference in California. I had a friend said, hey, I was watching your wife the other day, and she said something really funny. I said, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. Because so people all around the globe saw her do that faux pas. Now, here's the deal. We have a lot of communication problems in our churches. God still struggles with communicating His grace and love into His creation, all right? But I'm going to take this road and believe, in spite of these problems, I believe everything's going to be okay. And I believe everything can be better when we remember some of the communication principles that the Apostle Paul himself used on a fateful day in Athens. And the title of my talk today is, what does Athens have to do with my town, USA? Now, some of you who have some church history background know that is a quote from Tertullian, a 3rd century Christian, and it tends to deal most explicitly with the difference between Jerusalem and Athens. What does Athens have to do with Jerusalem is the original quote, and that it was talking about the conflict between faith and reason. But I want to change it up a little bit and say to you today that I believe that what happened in Paul's interaction with the Areopagus and the council there when he was speaking in Athens, that there are some principles that are there that if we can remember them and reinstitute them, that we can increase the effectiveness of our communication. So I know perhaps you didn't bring your Bible today. What I want to do is I want to kind of read the story for you again. Some of you may be aware of it. This may be new to some of you. And even to set it up, I would like to maybe show you a couple of pictures up here and give you a historical background a bit On the left, there's just a drawing of Athens in the 5th century, which was the heyday of Greece. This is the age of Pericles. Up on the left is the Acropolis, which is the Parthenon. Down here in the kind of center is the Agora, which means that was the marketplace. That was a public square. We get the word agoraphobia from that a fear of being out in public. And then kind of up into the top right, there is the assembly, and that is the Areopagus. That's Mars Hill. That is where there was kind of a council of elders up there, the elite, who would at one time or another, they would pass judgment on different laws. In the time of the Apostle Paul, however, they were not really the legal seat anymore. They were kind of the morality and religious thought police. And so anytime someone was teaching or saying something and there was some kind of dispute, then they would take them up to the Areopagus up there. And I'll never forget my New Testament class at Southwestern Seminary. One guy who was especially from Texas one day asked the professor, now professor, now tell me about this Areopagus place. So the Texas pronunciation of this is Areopagus. For the rest of the world, it's Areopagus, okay? So that's the place. All right, so you can, I think we're going to have the text up here. It's a little bit of a long story, but it's a very powerful story. And if you have any communication, sentiment in your body, you're going to love what the Apostle Paul does here, all right? Here's the story. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, Paul had just kind of been kicked out of Thessalonica and kicked out of Berea. Timothy and Silas had stayed behind in Berea, and Paul was waiting alone in Athens for them to get there. He was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. The marketplace is the Agora. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Now here's an interesting Greek note. The word in Greek for babbler is really, literally, seed picker. So here's what is this seed picker doing? This guy from the country, he's a country bumpkin. He's kind of picking up seeds of little bits of knowledge that don't make any sense. So they're really putting him down here. What is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we want to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Think of small town USA where you are, all kind of the old guys who go down to the town square and kind of sit back and play cards or dominoes and kind of just sit there all day. Okay, now this is a very elite group of people who did that all day. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands." Now, if you can go back and remember, around the Agora there, beneath the Acropolis, there were a multitude of temples. So Paul is responding there to what he is seeing. Now that you worship something is unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent. For He has set a day when He will judge the world with justice by the man He has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising Him from the dead. Now, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on the subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. All right, in that story, in that brief message, there are a lot of profound things taking place. And if we can unpack these together, I think that we will really understand some foundational things that we can relate to, but will also help us in our jobs. I believe that Paul faced two challenges that are very similar to the challenges that we are facing today. And here's the first one. The cultural context of the message of the gospel was radically different from the context of the listeners there that day. I want to say that again. The cultural context of the message of the gospel was radically different from the cultural context of his listeners that day. The story of the gospel is deeply rooted in Hebrew Jewish culture. And it is the Hebrew Jewish culture that gave rise to the language, to the images, to the aesthetics, to all the expressions of the gospel. And now look what's happening. Ideas and words like Messiah, Anointed One, Son of Man, Jubilee, Day of the Lord, these things that any Jewish person would know, these people who have grown up and lived their whole life in Greece without the internet, without a phone, most of them not having traveled more than probably 15 miles from their home, they don't know this. They are not aware of the story of Moses. You know, these people are clueless when it comes to Hebrew culture. Hellenistic culture knew not Moses. And so here Moses was having to communicate this incredible message to people who don't have the connecting points in their mind to hear it and receive it. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. I didn't really think about this until I was doing some preparation for this message, all right? The gospel was rooted in Jewish life, right? People spoke Hebrew. But Jesus and the disciples spoke what language? Aramaic. And then after Jesus was resurrected, the church wrote down the story of Jesus in what language? In Greek. It is amazing that the gospel survived at all given those kinds of communication barriers, because the Hebrew language and the Greek language are very different. You read Hebrew right to left. You read Greek left to right. There's no word order in Greek. The languages, the thought patterns and processes are incredibly different. And so from the very beginning, I think it's only through the power and the illumination of God's Spirit that this message was able to live and to be communicated cross-culturally. Here's what I want you to stop and think about for a moment. We are living in a post-modern age, right? I kind of grew up in the last throes of the modern age. Some of you grew up really smack dab in the heart of the postmodern age. But now we're living in what? The post-postmodern age. And here's what's taking place. You and I are trying to market to, we're trying to communicate with people outside the church and inside the church who do not know the backstory of the gospel. Heck, they don't even hardly know what the gospel is. In fact, more people in our culture today know who the situation is than they do what the resurrection is. More people are familiar with glee than they are the joy of the Lord. There are a lot of people in our culture who probably think that Mary and Martha are the two newest stars on the real Jerusalem Housewives. I mean, there is a paltry kind of blank spot in the minds and hearts of people in our culture today with the religious language and images and stories of the gospel. I always think back to this, and I started realizing this as I was relating to kids and helping lead them to Christ and stuff. You know, if you don't grow up in church and you don't have any of this background and someone asks you, would you like to invite Jesus into your heart? What in the world does that mean? Does that mean you want me to ask Jesus into my left ventricle? If you don't have this religious background, those words have no meaning to people. And so you and I face the same challenge that Paul did. How do we take this unchanging message of the gospel that transforms lives and communicate it in a context now where people don't know Moses, they don't know the Exodus, they don't know Jesus, they don't know who the 12 disciples are. They know the 3 chipmunks, but not the 12 disciples. It is a different world. So we have an incredible, incredible challenge. Here's the second challenge. Moses was also called on to communicate in multiple social networks. He was called upon to communicate in multiple social networks. Now, even though Paul preceded the internet by more than 2,000 years, he understood social networks. Now, they weren't in cyberspace. They were on terra firma. They were real social networks. And in this story, if you picked it up, he moved in and out of 3 social networks. Do you remember what they were? The synagogue, which is his primary modus operandi. He would go to these cities and he would begin to preach in the synagogues. But he also then moved to the agora, that is, the marketplace of the everyday Hellenistic Greek person. And then he had to communicate also where? In the Areopagus, which was the elite, the very smart people there, and he had to be able to communicate that there. I have my oldest son took up my penchant for arguing and elevated that to the point that he got into Yale Law School. And last year I was able to go visit him there, and I was in a symposium with about 15 Yale law professors. And while I'm sitting there listening and knowing their background and what they believe, my son kind of leans down to me and says, "Dad, this is probably the smartest room you've ever been in." And I said, "You are probably right." And I started thinking, if I started talking gospel and resurrection, and the exclusive claims of Christ to these guys, I would be laughed out of the room. I got a sense of how Paul must have felt when he was at the Areopagus. So he was having to move in and out of these 3 different social networks. But don't we have that same challenge today? We have different communication portals. There's email, texting, Twittering now. And now we have all kinds of different social media sites. I went online and I looked up the top 10 social media sites. Anybody want to guess what the number 1 site is? Facebook. You know what number 2 is? MySpace. MySpace is still number 2. Now here are the next 8. Are you ready for these? Bebo. Number 3. Any of you Bebo? I never heard of Bebo. What about Friendster? I've heard of Friendster. What about High Five? Anybody heard of High Five? Haven't heard of Five. What about Orkut? Or here's another one, Perf Spot. Not to be confused with Perp Spot, where all the ex-cons go to, I guess, to do social media, okay? Zorpia, Netlog, and Habbo. All right. This world of social media is not going to get smaller, it's going to get larger. Twitter, you have what? 140 characters. A blog can be longer. How in the world do we tailor our message and meet the challenge of communicating to people in all of these different settings? So I think we have the same challenge that the Apostle Paul did 2,000 years ago. Well, as we look at these challenges, I do think that Paul's response offers a very worthy model for us to take a look at. All right? So we're going to look at how he handled this. How did he respond to this? All right? And this first one is, I'm telling you, this is Communication 101. It is well done for most of us. It is from Aristotle's 5 canons of rhetoric. How many of you have that memorized? Some of you are communications majors, some of you, okay. It's basically this. Paul sought first to understand his audience. Paul sought first to understand his audience. When he got to Athens, he could have done a little R&R, but man, he starts walking around. I think he probably signed up to take the duck boat tour of Athens and just kind of travel around it and just start seeing what he could see. And there are several things that are said about Athens, that there was a forest of statues to gods in Athens. In fact, there were more statuary devoted to gods in Athens than the rest of Greece combined. So what does Paul do? He starts looking, observing, surveying the world in which he now finds himself. Now here's the thing that I think we all probably would say. We know this principle. We understand this principle. We think it's an important principle. But here's what happens. The culture is changing so quickly today that our assumptions of what is right and what is out there change right under our noses. And we can truly lose track of the people that we're trying to connect with, the people that are our target market. We can lose track of them very, very quickly. Let me ask you this. If you were going to try to market to women on television, would you reach more women if you advertised during soap operas or during sporting events? What do you think? It's an overwhelming response. So I'm going to say that probably we think, well, probably soap operas, but the answer is actually sporting events. You would not think that. That's counterintuitive. And so it's very important for us to stop assuming that we really have our finger on the pulse of our culture, our community where we are. Now, I think there are 2 things that you need to be aware of. That we need to be aware of our culture in general and in particular. I want to talk about in general first. First of all, in general, we need to have an understanding of what's in the air in our nation, in the larger culture. What's going on in the Tea Party? Anybody understand that? It's a huge movement. What's driving that? What's causing those people to create such a ruckus and to really overturn a lot of political party history? Okay? What's going on in terms of values in our country right now? Philosophically, what are people thinking? Are we still kind of in this scientific empiricism time? What are people thinking? And Paul was aware of that. He could relate to Epicurean philosophers and Stoic philosophers. He understood what was going on at the high level. He knew that Epicureans thought that everything happened by chance. He knew that Epicureans believed that there was nothing after you die. When you die, that's it. Kaput, you're over. He understood that their belief was that the ultimate end or the ultimate value for man was pleasure. On the other hand, the Stoics were exactly the opposite. They believed that God was in everything and that the spark of the divine was in every person. And when a person died, the spark went back to be with God. And because God was in everything, then God had already predetermined what everything is going to be. So here Paul is having to understand the predominant thinking that was going on in his world. And you and I cannot begin to seriously communicate the gospel in the world in which we live unless we understand some of these higher level things. But he looked at his place where he was now in particular. And as he was looking around and studying, he discovered a statue to an unknown god. So he found something local. He found something that was evidently important to the Athenians. Have any of you ever heard the story of how these unknown god statues came to be? It's a really interesting story. About 600 years prior to this, there was a terrible pestilence in the land, and Epimenides came up with this idea that what they would do is they would let a bunch of black and white sheep out, and they would let them go free from the Areopagus. And they would follow these sheep, and wherever they laid down, they would sacrifice that sheep to the closest altar to any given god. But there were some sheep who kind of laid down, and there wasn't an altar to any god anywhere near. And so then they just simply sacrificed that sheep right there and said, this sheep has been sacrificed to an unknown god. And there were a bunch of statues to unknown gods in Athens. And that's a picture of one of those statues to an unknown god. So what Paul does is he figures this out. He really begins to study where he is, not only in general, but in particular. Now, when Paul and I came to plant our church, I guess it's eight and a half years ago now, or maybe 9.5 if I do my math right. We came here with just two families, his wife Denise and my wife Robin and I. And we came here and we were going to kind of work behind the scenes for 7 months. And we said, wow, Frisco's a growing place. At that time, there were 35,000 people here. Today, there are almost 110,000 people 8 years later. But we started doing demographic stuff. And we thought we'd come here and start with the worship service and all that kind of stuff. But the more we studied and the more we looked around us, here's what we discovered, an incredible demographic factor. In 2002, there were more children birthed to 4 living in the Frisco Independent School District boundaries than all children grades K through 12 enrolled in school. Think about that. All right, so if you're going to plant a church in this place, what would you do? You'd plant a church that's going to somehow connect with what? Young families, parents of children. So we launched our church at Stonebriar Mall, one of the biggest malls in North Texas, down the road in the AMC Theater, and we did a Texas knockoff of North Point Church's kids stuff. And we called it Dude Ranch. And we opened our doors in September of 2002, and Paul and I didn't preach a single message until January of 2003. We just did kid stuff, but we called it Dude Ranch. And we reached almost 200 adults and children by doing that in that first year. But we never dreamed that we would come here and start a church and not preach. Okay? But we got here and we looked at what was here and the dynamics of this community, and it caused us to change everything and the way we communicated. So maybe you know exactly what's going on in your community, but maybe you've been assuming too much. And maybe one of the first things you need to do when you go back to your place of service is to get in touch again with the people in your community. Don't assume anything. Find out what they think and what they're struggling with and where they're hurting. We did a recent demographic study now. You know what the number one problem and issue is for people living in Frisco? Marriage problems. You know what we're starting? A marriage ministry. Okay? You can't assume that you know what's going on. So Paul did not do that. Here's the second thing that Paul did. Paul critiques the culture, but not to condemn it, but to connect with it. Paul critiqued the culture, not to condemn it, but to connect with it. Now, there are a lot of people and a lot of churches, and there's a lot of probably justified criticism, that in their attempt to be relevant in our culture today, they've kind of bought into some of the values of our culture. I'll never forget the time in my first full-time pastorate, I had a wonderful young adult Sunday school teacher. She was a young believer, still kind of wet behind the ears and stuff. And it was the time when the musical, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, was out. And so she and her husband went to see it down in Austin. And she came back and she said, Jim, I was just wondering, could I teach a Sunday school lesson on the fact that prostitutes aren't really all that bad? And I went, what? I said, why? And so she told me she'd gone to sing. I said, well, Sandy, I said, here's the deal. That's fantasy. That's not a picture of reality. And here's, it portrayed this little whimsical approach to prostitution, the best little whorehouse in Texas. And she said, well, maybe I need to talk about that. No, you don't. No, we're not going to do that. Okay, so you don't want to buy into the culture. But Paul doesn't critique the culture in order to condemn it. He does it so he can connect with it. But I think we have done more harm than good as Christ followers and as leaders by critiquing our culture so that we can rant about it in a weekend service, or so we can have some kind of fodder for our outdoor marquee sign, right? That's not what Paul did. Paul takes this statue of the unknown God and he uses it as the launching point for his whole message. He did that. He surveyed it. He was distraught by it, distressed by it, the text said, but he did it in order to have a connecting point with the people. Now here's something, if you don't know this, I hope you'll really let this sink in. Condemnation has a low rate of return in marketing. Condemnation has a very low rate of return in marketing. If you want to create an installment campaign in your church, just start condemning everybody and every sin and everything. Because people don't want to hear that. On the other hand, connection points gain a hearing. Connection points gain a hearing. I think there are two ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there are people who use cultural critique as a kind of as a bat to condemn people. On the other end of the spectrum is what I call ignorance. And ignorance is this, is that people do church and they live church and they preach messages and they market as if the things that are going on in culture aren't even there. That is, that they do church and they talk and they communicate as if they're doing it in a vacuum. That's not what Paul does. He finds connection points. The statue to the unknown God is his connecting point. Now, here is the last thing that Paul does, and he does it really well. And I think this gets at the heart of our challenge, and it is this. Paul tailors his message to be indigenous. He tailors his message to be indigenous to his listeners. Now, that word indigenous is not one that we use in our vocabulary every day. How many of you used the word indigenous in a conversation yesterday? Okay, nobody. All right, I hope you will start using it more. Now, what does the word indigenous means? It means native to the soil. It means native. All right? So, for example, God's word and the gospel message transcends time and culture. Do you believe that? The message of God's love, what Christ has done for us, transcends time and culture. And yet, every time the gospel gets planted in the heart of the human, and that human begins to express what has happened inside of him, it takes shape in language and in music and in art, aesthetics, everything. And so the expression of the gospel is always culturally expressed. Let me give you an example I've used from time to time. That is, if I were going to, and I grew up Southern Baptist, I'm kind of non-denominational now. Paul and I kind of say we're recovering Baptists. That's kind of how we are. And so I grew up, Baptist. So if I were going to go and be a Baptist missionary in Zimbabwe, all right, you say, oh, that's great, I'll pray for you. And now what if I told you my strategy? As I go to Zimbabwe, I'm going to take a pump organ, the 1976 version of the Baptist hymnal, 3 months of Baptist Sunday School quarterlies, some Silver Lord Supper trays, and I'm going to go and I'm going to start a church in Zimbabwe. Now, what are my probabilities of doing really well in that culture? What, next to zero, right? Why is that? Because my expression of the gospel is a cultural swing and miss. Correct? So here's what we have to always make sure we're doing, is that we are communicating, marketing, talking about the message, even the way we do things creatively in services. have to be done in a way that is native or indigenous to the people we're trying to reach. Right now, there's in kind of church literature, there's a real backlash against being relevant. Have you heard that? Have you kind of read some of those books right now? We're not going to be relevant anymore. We're going to be biblical, okay? And that sounds really good, but I want you to stop and think about this a second. Every church is relevant to some culture. But every church gets to choose what culture they're going to be relevant to. That is, we can go back and we can read the King James Version. We can start talking in these and thous again. We can be as traditional as we want to, and we'll be relevant, but we'll be relevant to, 17th century Great Britain. Here's another thing. If you want to really get away from this relevance deal, then okay, every time you meet in church, read and study from the Greek. Speak in the Greek. I mean, that's the original, right? So every church, every group, every speaker has to communicate this unchanging gospel in an indigenous, native way. Now, Paul did this in two ways. He did this, first of all, in terms of his method. That is the way he went about it. In his message, he incorporates three cultural references. We've already talked about the statue to the unknown God. But he also makes two references to Greek or Cilician poets. One to Epimenides, in him we live and move and breathe and have our being. That's a quote. And one from Areopagus, we are his offspring. Now here's what Paul does. He takes a quote from a non-Christian philosopher that is true. And then he uses that as a connecting point to gain credibility with his Greek listeners so that he can get them to listen to the rest of the story of the gospel. This is not new. The Apostle John does this in his gospel when he says that in the beginning was the what? The Word. And the word in Greek is what? Logos, which is a Greek concept. And so John himself was trying to make these connections so that the gospel could be communicated in native, indigenous ways. So that's why when we're speaking, when we're marketing, when we're doing things, I was in Lawrence Swicegood's breakout deal. He was talking about a poster they did for Vacation Bible School one year, and Star Wars was about to come out. And so they named their Vacation Bible School Space Chase. Well, here's the deal. That was highly cultural, but they just kind of hitched their star to that cultural thing, and they increased their attendance of kids in Bible school by a significant amount. All right, so it's okay to borrow cultural references in order to gain credibility for your message. But here's the thing I love, and what I really appreciate about this, is that Paul actually tailors his message. He tailors his message. What he speaks about, his vocabulary, how much he talks about Jesus and the backstory. Now, I don't have time to do this now, but if you'd like a really good exercise, tonight when you're at home, back in your home or in the hotel, read through Acts chapter 13, verses 16 and following, and this is Paul's address to a Jewish audience at Pisidian Antioch. And in this address, he talks about Moses and being released from captivity and Abraham. He goes through everything. It's every cultural allusion to God's working through the nation of Israel. It's all there. All of those words, all of those ideas, okay? But here, when he's talking to these Greeks, you don't get any of that. Look at what he says. He basically says this: there is a God who is the maker of all things, and he is not made by anyone. In fact, he made all people of all nations everywhere. And he is not to be worshiped by things that are made. Now, he's given people a break for a season, but now the break time is over. And there is a man who is going to come, and he's going to judge justly all of creation. And this man was appointed by God, and he was validated by the fact that he was raised from the dead. Amen? Stand, sing 3 verses to him. That's it. Now, I want you to look at this. This is the same writer who writes these incredible Christological praise hymns in Philippians chapter 2. I mean, he talks about Jesus being the full presence of God dwelling bodily in him. I mean, all of these illustrious things about Jesus. But look at what he says here. He says, but there was a man appointed by God. That is all he said. He doesn't say his name. He was appointed by God, and God validated him by raising him from the dead. That's it. So what Paul does here is that he tailors this message, this first blush for them, so that it can be heard and can be indigenous to them. And that is a challenge that we face in our communication. And that is to be able to tailor our message in method and in message so that people who don't have the backstory of Judeo-Christian stories can begin to hear the gospel, allow it to be planted in their hearts and souls, and for it to begin to grow. Oswald Chambers has one of my favorite quotes. He says this: the gospel is not primarily persuasive, it is creative. And this is what he means, is that when someone hears the message of the love of God and the grace of Christ, it's like a seed that gets planted in the heart, and it begins to grow. It's nurtured. And after a while, it gets so big inside a person's heart, they either have to say yes to it or they rip it out. But the Apostle Paul realizes you can plant seeds and they can grow, and the Spirit will grow them. So he tailors the message. Now, here's the deal. I would like to say that Paul did this so well that everybody in the Areopagus got up, praised Jesus, and they started a brand new church called the Areopagus Community Church, and they started meeting the next week. Didn't happen. There were 3 basic kinds of responses here. Some of the people mocked Paul. Some of the people were curious about what Paul said, and some of the people believed. And you know what? If we're going to creatively communicate the gospel in our day, we can just count on those same 3 responses: mockery, curiosity, and belief and faith. And we just need to keep communicating. Now, I just want to leave you just with one takeaway. And there's kind of just 3 brief parts. If I could give you any help or any encouragement, here's what I would encourage you to do. And most of you probably have already done this, but if you haven't, please do this. Go back to your church with a volunteer or a staff member and identify 3 champions. 3 champions, people to champion 3 things. The first one is this: find someone who will be your culture champion. Someone who understands culture. Someone who knows who in the heck the situation and Snooki are. Okay? You don't have to watch Jersey Shore, but someone needs to be in charge of knowing what's going on in culture. Our director of content development here is a young lady named Allison Harrell. She has 4 kids, 2 girls and 2 boys, and she is the most culturally astute person I know, and we rely on her a lot. Find someone who can champion exegeting your culture. Second, find a social media champion. Jody is our social media champion. She's been trying to get me to blog, to Twitter. I mean, she tries to get me to do all kinds of... Jody, you got to do most of that stuff, okay? But find someone who's going to really get you on top of this social media aspect. And one last thing. If you don't have it, get someone who is a message champion. Could be your pastor, could be you, our director of communications, and I, and a few others. We work really hard in all of our communication to take all of these things into consideration as we communicate our message. All right? 3 champions: a culture champion, a social media champion, and a message champion. And you can carry out the methodology of the Apostle Paul. And I think you can take the gospel to the Athens, which is your town. All right, let's pray together. Father, thank you for this incredible story of Paul's faithfulness, his creativity, and his willingness to step out on a limb for the sake of the gospel. May we have that same courage and creativity as we serve you in the places to which you've called us. In Jesus' name, amen.